how do you address a lot of the issues people have with hypnosis as a method? And I know I'm sure you use multiple methods, but this comes up a lot, especially with this subject matter, where the debunkers or whoever is trying to discredit this idea, they say, well, hypnosis is basically leading the witness, so therefore we're just creating fantasies and you're encouraging fantasies within your patients. How would you address that type of, statement or idea?
Well, firstly, for the detractors, what do they call that? That group, the repressed memory group. What do they call that?
Oh, the false memory
false
syndrome
memory
society,
syndrome.
False memory syndrome.
Yeah.
which is a false label.
Yes. And if you followed any of Professor Jennifer Freyd's work, do you know her work?
No, I haven't heard of it.
Well, she's the one who started having some, realizing that maybe she needed some help and was sexually abused, and went to a licensed psychologist in the States, Jennifer Freyd, Freyd. And she went to a licensed psychologist. After a couple of sessions, she started having spontaneous memory about her dad molesting her. And so she went and confronted him privately, and he vehemently denied it. And he was a very wealthy man, and I wonder, I have no evidence of this, but it's crossed my mind that maybe her dad was connected in some way. I don't know that, but I've questioned it myself, because he put a lot of money into supporting the idea that any accusation about sexual abuse was false. And he put tracts in libraries everywhere. In Barrie, just south of here, there are tracts that say, this is all false, this didn't happen to you. He even sent out representatives to discredit any accusations of sexual abuse in court cases. There was one fellow from that organization who came up here to Simcoe County when Cindy Blazewski was here, and he went home defeated. She knew her stuff, and he was later fired, this guy, for extolling the virtues of man-boy love in a Dutch pedophile magazine, so that's how credible that organization is.
Yeah. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation, mostly through the 1990s and probably into the early 2000s, where they really hit the press hard, claiming that these memories of ritual abuse and that dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation was claiming that therapists created that in their patients by looking for about it, etc. And so there were a lot of lawsuits against therapists. There was a lot of negative media attention, making therapists look foolish and even malevolent. And so I think a lot of therapists backed down out of fear. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation was created initially by people who were accused of abusing their children. And that organization coined the term, invented a quote-unquote syndrome, false memory syndrome. There is no such thing as false memory syndrome. The way they define it, it is not a medical or psychiatric syndrome. They're claiming that therapists ask improper questions, and that causes a person to believe they were abused when they weren't, and that's a syndrome. So the whole thing is very politically motivated. Now, people have analyzed the motives and the origins of the members of the advisory board for the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, and some very interesting dots end up being connected. Colin Ross has an article on the internet that connects the dots in a very logical, clear way. It's called Building the Manchurian Candidate. And he shows that this person on the advisory board actually had this motivation, and his motivation or her motivation is supported by, they're connected to this other person who worked for these people, and these people were connected to the grants that were part of the MK Ultra project, and he builds a very, very strong case to show, to strongly suggest that that organization pulled together to suppress the information that was coming out about both ritual abuse, about the government projects like MK Ultra, about dissociative identity being a true psychiatric disorder. It absolutely is. It used to be called multiple personality disorder. Now it's dissociative identity disorder. So that organization liked saying that therapists had made people believe that there is no such disorder, which is absurd. And even child abuse in general, trying to make it look like many, many accounts of child abuse are false memories implanted by therapists. So that organization, in my opinion, has been largely discredited professionally, because when they formed themselves, because most of them were not licensed clinicians and didn't have the ethical requirements that we have to not just, talk flippantly, but we have to back what we say. But they did not have to do that, so they would make very broad brush, absurd statements, and they couldn't get complaints made against them to licensing boards or lawsuits or anything for the things that they said. And then the psychology and psychiatry communities had to start showing that the things that they were saying were not true. So in other words, just because a memory is recovered in therapy doesn't mean it's a false memory. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that recovered memories are true. And most people that do believe that they were abused and are talking about it in therapy had some memories before they came to the therapist, so it's not true that the therapist created those memories. So the research that disproved a lot of the outrageous claims of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, that took years to do, and now it's been done. And so now they really don't have a leg to stand on. And the False Memory Syndrome, that entity, that diagnosis, whatever you want to call it, everybody knows, or all educated mental health professionals know that it's not a true thing. But it did a lot of damage. It affected the media, it affected the general public, and it affected survivors. So a lot of survivors of ritual abuse and a lot of people who have dissociative identity disorder, they started questioning their memories. Well, they don't like their memories. Their memories are horrifying. Their memories are distressing. Their memories give them post-traumatic stress disorder. So they started thinking, maybe I did make this all up. Well, that has its advantages to believe they made it all up. So a lot of survivors started questioning their own memories and believing that they did have false memory syndrome, and it kind of set them back because unfortunately or fortunately, trauma does not disappear. It kind of keeps scratching on the back door. The pain inside of a person seeks expression, it seeks support, it wants somebody to have compassion, sympathy for what they went through. So all it does is delay the healing process. But I've communicated with many survivors who were very harmed by that. And then therapists who are not trauma experts, or not adequately educated in trauma, can have learned about this whole controversy in the newspaper instead of in their scientific journals. So they believe dissociative identity disorder is not real. So the person comes to their office and says, I hear these voices inside my head, and they diagnose them as schizophrenic. Or the person comes in and says, I remember, when I was 3 years old being sexually abused on an altar, and the therapist believes they're delusional because they learned about ritual abuse from the local newspaper. So the False Memory Syndrome Foundation did a lot of damage, but educated clinicians know that it's not a credible organization and it's not a true syndrome.
ritual abusers, and I'm wondering if they would go through the whole, costume thing, embed in their victims, actually, to them, it's a true memory, but it's of a false situation, and that is they were not abducted by aliens, but that is what they've been implanted with, and that's the cover that the abusers can hide behind. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, that's extremely interesting.
Common among ritual abuse survivors.
Now, that is not to say, and I don't know, that is not to say, I would assume, that some folks who claim to have that happened would have necessarily been victims of this, or maybe I'm wrong. Do you believe it's a 100% deal? I doubt it would be, but what do you think about that those who claim they may have been abductees might have very well been, unwittingly, victims of abusers?
Yeah, I think some people who believe they were abductees are ritual abuse victims. But as far as some people who believe they're abductees truly be abductees, that's sort of out of my area. I'm so busy trying to figure out ritual abuse. I don't spend time trying to figure out the stuff about aliens. I'm very kind of myopic. I know what I know, and I don't know a lot about other things. But as a therapist, I don't ever discount anything. I don't feel like I have a right to say, that's not true. I would listen to the person and, just try to search for truth. Truth is always the goal.
All right. Well, and then again, you had talked about another false front, which would have been those who got behind the false memory syndrome. So here we have, in both cases, what would look like fronts for those who are the abusers. Would that be correct?
Look like fronts from the abusers?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're saying?
In other words, both of these would be fronts for the actual abusers.
Okay. I legally cannot say that every single person who's a member of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation is actually abuser motivated to create a front. But I would say that I would expect that to be true of many, if not most, of people in the False Memory Syndrome Foundation.
The False Memory Syndrome Foundation and Satanic Ritual Abuse. Dr. Martin T. Orne is the original board member of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation and a senior CIA Navy researcher at the University of Pennsylvania's Experimental Psychiatry Laboratory, as well as a close friend of Dr. George Estabrooks. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation was created to deny the existence of cult mind control and child abuse, and is staffed with psychiatrists connected to the CIA and their mind control experimentation. The phenomenon of children being coached or led to invent tales of abuse or making up such stories does exist, but comprises a small minority of the reported cases of child abuse, between 2 and 8% of reported cases. One survey found 88% of therapists consider ritual child abuse to be a very real social problem. Only 5% of all child abuse cases ever enter the courtroom. Half of these end with the child returned to the custody of the abusive parent. Dr. Orne's research into hypnoprogramming at Cornell University in the 1960s was paid for by the Human Ecology Fund and the SEI Corporation, both CIA cutouts. This also funded the work of Dr. Ewan Cameron's brainwashing and remote mind control experimentation. CIA-funded black psychiatry at that time specialized in electroshock lobotomies, drugging agents, incapacitants, hypnosis, sleep deprivation, and radio control of the brain. The FMSF founder Ralph Underwager and his wife openly advocate pedophilia, saying, quote, "It was God's will for adults to engage in sex with children." He told British reporters in 1994 that, quote, "Scientific evidence proved 60% of all women molested as children believed the experience was good for them," unquote. Dr. Underwager is the world's foremost authority on false memory, but in court is repeatedly revealed as a charlatan. Numerous others of the FMSF have connections to pedophilia, covert operations, and black psychiatry. Peter and Pamela Freyd, executive directors of the FMSF, have been accused of sexual abuse by their daughter, a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon. The industrial production of FMSF stories in journals, newspapers, and TV have shaped public opinion on this subject. The very concept of false memory served the same purpose as Holocaust denial. Crimes are obstructed, the accused wears the veil of a martyr, and the victim is reviled. Dr. Douglas Besharov is the director of the American Enterprise Institute and former director of the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect. He writes articles that attack the victims of abuse, and has been caught fabricating statistics when claiming scientific rationale for the basis of his statements. In 1986, Besharov published Unfounded Allegations, A New Child Abuse Problem, and numerous other cover stories to confuse this issue. These individuals are engaged in a psychological warfare operation to cover up reports of the CIA's mind control operations. For 30 years, the CIA has collaborated with cults, many of them founded by the government, in order to conceal the development of mind control technology.
You found out that someone within the police department, a constable, had said that pretty much your files and your reports were being deleted.
Mm-hmm.
Did he mention anything beyond that as to, maybe you should be careful, or there's higher, something going on within the police here? Did you get that feeling right away that this wasn't just some small group, that there was something going on with blocking an actual investigation within the police department, or?
Well, I think he was brave to tell me that much to begin with, and I thank him for that. At the time, I think I was in such shock that would be happening. Later, I put it together of just how incredibly organized this is. It's like this giant underground connection, and you don't know who belongs to it and who doesn't. And evidence disappears all the time. I had somebody call me up from Base Borden, and he had been part of something there. I can't remember what it was. I was a little afraid to go and meet with him because he said, you're dealing with satanic abuse, right? And I said, yeah, but at that point I dipped my toe in the water, but really didn't know anything about it. And I met him for lunch, and he said it goes on at the base all the time. And I said, well, where's the evidence? And he said, we have to turn in any evidence, and eventually as it gets passed along, that evidence disappears. And I think that happens in a lot of cases, where it's really hard to get evidence about this. But there's a huge network. I think the Masons being a case in point. And not everybody in the Masons is into the dark side of things, but I know there is a stream of people in the Masons who are, and the good guys have no idea that the other side is there.
It's so compartmentalized, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah.
But in the Middle Ages, the Masons flew two standards, the dark and the light, and they walked both paths, So I don't know exactly what those paths entail, but I would assume that one gets better and better the higher they go towards their 33rd degree, and the other gets worse and worse. And it's all about dealing in power and unseen power. Ancient
knowledge that has been blocked from our view now. Like a lot of people are completely unfamiliar with this in our day. We're so absorbed in television world and, is the mall open, and working our jobs and paying our taxes and trying to be good, productive citizens and all this, and obeying the, innumerable amount of laws that are put up for everybody to follow every day. But when there's something going on in the undercurrent behind world events, behind local events, or behind events in just individuals' lives, which is where you came in, to peer into that takes a lot of courage. And it definitely, over the years, I'm sure your own sanity and your own reason and courage has been probably tested by choosing to go down this road? Have you found it to be kind of a lonely path to seek this out, or do you find support?
Yeah, I think all my friends are in this room.
Wow.
I'm just kidding, but kind of not. It's very lonely. People step back from you. I can clear a room, you know, if I start talking about this.
I've heard so many credible reports of a lot of Masonic, a lot of horrible abuse happening within Masonic lodges, and there are a lot of powerful people obviously connected to Masonic lodges. That I do believe that a lot of ritual abuse happens within Masonic lodges. Now, I am not saying that all Masons by any means are practicing evil. I don't believe that. But in fact, I have actually no way of knowing how much the ritual abuse that happens in Masonic lodges is actually somehow part of the structure of Freemasonry versus how much it's people who are using that for their own proclivities, you know. So, but quite a few survivors that I find highly credible claim that their abusers were important Freemasons.